Hello, it's Dr. Rafael Gutierrez. Welcome to this lecture. Today I'm going to talk about the integumentary system, and as you can see, I am using images from KenHub. I have actually emailed them. They said it was okay for me to use some of the images so I can show my class how things work. And so some of the images I am using are from KenHub, some are my own personal images, and some I've had from articles that I've read. But when we're talking about the integumentary system, it helps to know the tissue types. And so if you don't have a firm grasp of tissues, please review the tissues lecture and lab before. Now, one of the things you'll notice is there are three main layers of the integumentary system, or the skin, and there are modifications that we are going to see. So I will talk about some of those. And you can actually see already that there are certain things. For instance, you can see the top layer here is called the epidermis. The dermis is here. And the bottom area here, which is made of adipose tissue mainly, is the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous, which I'll mention more about it as we go on. Now, skin functions for in a lot of things. One is it actually does make a mechanical barrier, not allowing certain things in. For instance, bacteria can actually are maintained outside, and a lot of that bacteria that's on your skin is actually really helpful. It's normal flora. It keeps other infections, other bacteria that can actually cause skin infections uh, from infecting the deeper areas. It also works to keep a certain amount of radiation, namely UV radiation, from damaging the tissues inside. It also acts to maintain water on the right side of the body. And so it does actually act as a barrier, which will help you out. If you ever deal with burns, you'll notice that infections, dehydration tend to be big problems. The other thing that it does is it does a lot of thermoregulation. This is done in two ways. One is by using the blood vessels near the skin, dilating, making the skin more red to get rid of some heat, and also, I should say, by using sweat glands. It's also a main sensory organ. You can actually feel aspects of the skin, and those are actually really important to understand. Now, there are some basic vocabulary which will help when you're looking at the skin. First one, which I tell people, is dermis. Dermis will mean skin. Epi means top or outer, and you have hypo, which is deep. You also do have cutaneous, which means referring to skin, and so you have the sub also, which means underneath. So if you look at the words like epidermis, it means top skin. Dermis is just a skin layer, and the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous, both mean the same thing, which is under the dermis, under the skin. Now, I do like you guys to see the embryology just because it shows you how things occur. And so one of the things you see here is you see the three layers of cells forming: the epiblast, the hypoblast, and this in the middle will become the mesoderm. The epiblast becomes the ectoderm. The mesoderm is the middle layer, and the endoderm is the inner layer. The reason it's called inner is because this is going to go through gastrulation and folding, which is going to lead to a gut tube. You're also going to pull in part of the neural tube, the ectoderm, to form a neural tube, and the mesoderm is going to be in the middle here. Now, epidermis is actually pretty much begins to develop in the third week, but really continues developing it throughout life. Actually, technically, it develops as an embryological structure throughout pregnancy. So one of the things you'll notice is between week 5 and 7, the ectoderm forms two layers. One of them is called the periderm. The other one is the stratum basale. Stratum means layer, basalis means base. So you actually have the lower level of the epidermis, which is going to be formed with cells called the stratum, it's going to be formed by a layer of cells called the stratum basalis. One of the things that happens is the periderm actually starts forming keratin, which is a intercellular protein which is excreted. So it goes through from the DNA to the mRNA to the ribosomes. Ribosomes will make it into proteins on top of the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Rough endoplasmic reticulum will take the vacuole with the keratin, send it to different areas, and this layer will progressively build up. Now this actually occurs in about week 21, and more skin layers are actually going to be developing during this time period. You actually do have the stratum spinosum and stratum granulosum. Stratum spinosum, spinosum technically means flat or spiky. Granulosum, granule means grainy, so it has granules in there. What usually is happening is as the cells move away from the stratum basalis, they actually start dying, and so you have different layers form. Now, by the third month of conception, you do have neural crest cells migrate to the basement membrane area, and they start forming what are called melanocytes. The melanocytes, site means cell, melano is melanin. It's a pigmented substance, so the melanocytes are going to make melanin. Now, over here, again, I have an image from KenHub, and you can see the layers of the epidermis. You can see on the top area here is an area called the stratum corneum. Cornea technically means hard, so you have the hard layer. Then you have a clear layer right underneath it called the stratum lucidum, lucidum meaning clear. You then have a grainy layer right under it called the stratum granulosum. Then the spiny layer, which I told you is stratum spinosum, and the basement layer, the bottom layer, stratum basalis. And you do have a membrane, which is called the basement membrane, which holds the basal cells in place. Now remember, you do have melanocytes, so melano means pigmented, which are going to give the skin its color. Now there are some specialized cells in the skin. The basal cells, the cells at the lowest level, are usually cuboidal cells, and they're the cells that are constantly going through mitosis. And so they make cells, one is going to replace it, the next one is going to move up, and slowly it's going to move away from the basement membrane and start modifying itself and dying. You do then have squamous cells, and the tissue is stratified squamous epithelium. And so you start forming the stratum spinosum, which are the flat layers. And like I said before, the stratum granulosum is producing a lot of keratin, which is the granules you see inside. And these cells are dying. You also do have the melanocytes, like I mentioned, which tend to protect you from UV radiation. Besides that, you also do have Langerhans cells, which are immune cells and a type of histocytes, which will be covered more in immunology. You also do have something called a Merkel cell, which is responsible for pressure sensations. Now the dermis, the layer just under the epidermis, starts forming between week 5 and 8. And what happens, you can see here a bunch of bumps, which are actually somites. But this is not a KenHub image, by the way. This is, I think it was originally from Frank Netter. But you have the somites, and the somites will break into 3 parts. One of them is going to be called the sclerotome, one of them is going to be called the myotome, and one of them is going to be the dermatome. Sclero means hard, such as atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. So the sclerotome will make a hard layer, which will actually form around the cranium and the vertebral column. Then you also have the myotome. Myo means muscle, and so myotome is going to make the skeletal muscles of your body mainly. And then you have something called the dermatome, which is going to make the dermis of the skin. So what the dermis, when you look at, when I show it to you, you're going to see it's made up of 2 layers. One of them is called the papillary layer, and the other one is going to be called the reticular layer, corpus papillary and corpus reticularis. Now corpus means body, so papillary technically are finger or finger-like projections, and they are actually going to push into the epidermis, forming ridges. There are capillaries there, and this is where a lot of the ducts for hair follicles and sweat glands are. You do have something called the Meissner's plexus found there, which is responsible for feeling vibrations. And the papillary layer, if you look at your hands and look at your fingers, you'll see a lot of ridges. The papillary is responsible for things like fingertips, fingerprints, and these are also found in the toes as well. So you do have toe prints, I guess you could say. The reticular layer is the main portion. It's made of dense regular connective tissue. The papillary tends to be more areolar tissue. And it does have something called the Pacinian corpuscle, which is involved in sensation of movement around the skin. Pacinian corpuscles, by the way, are also found in tendons for stretching. Now you do also have the hair follicle there, erector pili muscles, and it does contain some exocrine glands. These exocrine means outside, crine means secretory. So you're going to actually have two exocrine glands that are going to be found in here. One of them is going to be the sebaceous glands, the other is the sudoriferous glands, which I'll mention a little later. So the reason I was going to mention it later is because of this picture. Here you can see the basics of hair. Now, when you look at hair, you will see that hair has an outer layer called the cortex and the inner layer called the medulla. I would recommend writing down cortex means outer layer, medulla means inner layer, because hair will have a cortex and medulla, and other structures will as well. You also can see here this big bulb, which is called the bulb of the hair follicle. And you can see glands here called sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands make a wax or oil, which do help in a lot of things. It actually does help maintain the integrity of the skin. It actually helps make the skin a little bit more water protective from water loss, and it does help get rid of some bacteria as well. While it's not here, you do also have a muscle here called the erector. It's arrector, not erector, papillae muscle, which helps the hair follicle become erect when you're cold or scared. Now, I took this image from Johns Hopkins, and it just shows you the two layers of skin a bit better. You can see the epidermis. Epi again means outer, dermis skin. You can kind of see the layers. And one of the things that actually is important is the epidermis kind of invaginates in here to form the matrix, which is going to form the hair follicle, which comes out. You can see the sebaceous gland over here. Again, it's in the dermis technically, even though it is covered by epidermal cells. And you can see a sweat gland up here. Now you do have some sweat glands that are in the dermis. You will find a few in the hypodermis, which we'll talk about later. And you can see some free nerve endings coming up here. You can also see the capillary and the blood vessels. You'll notice that the capillaries here feed the basement membrane of the epidermis. That's one of the reasons why as cells divide and move up, you end up having less nutrients to it, and so they tend to pretty much die off. Okay, so the hypodermis begins at about week 5, and it continues until birth, and for some of us, even after birth. And it is formed by mesodermal mesenchymal cells, which are mesodermal origin, and they are composed of mainly adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat tissue, which you will remember from the histology lecture. It is highly vascular. This is where you have the blood vessels coming into it. And it does have a lot of functions. It does store energy. It also keeps the body insulated, so cold will not necessarily come into the internal organs. And it also can be a nice mechanical protection. What I mean by that is if trauma hits the body, the adipose tissue can spread it so it acts almost as a cushion. Now, there are specialized skins, and the first two I'm going to talk about is, it shouldn't say thick skin, it should say thick skin. This should be thick skin. It's found in the hands and the soles. One of the important things about it is it doesn't have hair. It also has a thicker stratum corneum, and it has thicker dermal layer. The reason that that's important is because it actually allows you to form the ridges that give you fingerprints. So when you grab something, it produces a bit more friction, so things don't slide off. It doesn't have hair because hair will actually make things harder to grab on if you had it on your palms and feet. Thin skin is found in most of the body area. They actually have a pronounced dermal papilla, and they have a lot of hair. They actually, it's actually not pronounced, I'm sorry, it's actually less than dermal papillae. You don't see a lot of fingerprints, a lot of ridges on your thin skin. I don't know why it's pronounced, probably autocorrect. Now another specialized structure which is very similar to hair, it's actually made of the same thing, which is keratin, is nails. And one of the things you'll notice is there are certain things that are important to know. For instance, the nail is actually made here by the matrix, the nail matrix, and you have the plate where the nail is actually being pushed. You do have the bed where the nail is going to be resting, and you do have the cuticle here. It is just an extension of skin, you'll find, and well, I'll cover more on skin if you need to later. The last specialized structure that is found that skin is actually a part of is breast. Now, a lot of times people like to cover breasts in the reproduction system. I do like you guys to see it early so you can see how skin is modified. And one of the first things that I will tell you, and I got this picture, by the way, from the Komen Center, you can see that you have a nipple. And you can see here, nipple here, and then you have a tissue area around the nipple called the areola. Now, the areola does actually secrete a wax as well. It is a specialized type of, you do have actually a specialized type of sweat gland here, which is your lactiferous glands. And the lactiferous glands come together to a duct, and these are what actually will produce milk. They are under endocrine control, so if you have prolactin hormone, it will actually start getting the breast to produce milk. The other thing you'll notice is that it has an exaggerated amount of adipose tissue around it. That adipose tissue is a main part of the breast, and within the adipose tissue you do have ligaments down called the suspensory ligaments, which help keep the breast up. Now, that's all I'm going to talk about skin at this point. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and any questions you can ask me in class or you can write them down in comments. Have a nice day.